pleased to present our speaker today. Hans Angress is a member of our community. He's a board member with the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide at Sonoma State University. And he has taken on responsibility for speaking to many, many groups in the Bay Area about his experiences. So what I'm going to do is just give you a short introduction to Hans, and then I think you'll be very moved by not only his story, but also by what he has taken away from his experience. So Hans was born in Germany on April 14th, getting close to your birthday, 1928. I think he's got more energy than I do. His parents' names were Ernst and Henny Angress. He had two older brothers, Tom and Fred. And Hans describes his family as a typical upper middle class German Jewish family. His father owned a small bank and his mother was a homemaker. In September 1937, the family fled Germany due to the increasingly restricting laws affecting Jews. After a short stay in London, they returned to the European continent because they were unable to get to North or South America within a reasonable amount of time. If you remember from your reading, people were desperate to find a way to get out of Europe. But they returned to the continent in 1938 and settled in Amsterdam, Holland. Hans's brother Tom was able to get to the United States with a group of young Jewish people who were trained to be farmers. Other than Tom's departure, life was relatively normal for Hans and his family until the Germans invaded Holland on May 10th, 1940. After Holland was captured by the Nazis, Hans' father was arrested as a criminal for having illegally left Germany. And I'll let him expound on that, but that probably means he took some money with him. Hans, his mother, and brother Fred survived in Amsterdam through various means until they had no choice but to go into hiding in the fall of 1943. Hans was hidden by Anton and Alida Cooey, who had two sons, Peter and Walter. The Cooeys were a Dutch working class family that was involved in the Dutch resistance, which was a secret organization which fought the Nazis and saved countless number of Jews' lives. In 1989, the Cooey family was honored by the Holocaust Memorial Yad Vashem in Israel for their heroism and awarded the Medal of the Righteous Among Nations. And Barbara Boxer was even here to present a congressional recognition certificate to the Cooeys for their bravery. So Hans has a very interesting story, very different from some of the stories that we've heard, and it's my pleasure to present him to you.
Thank you for your kind introduction. The reason why I like to share my experiences growing up during the Nazi period in Germany and in Holland is in the hope to once more point out what human beings are capable to do to each other, and to point out how thin the veneer of civilization really is. Another reason is that I promised my brother Tom on his deathbed last summer that I would continue to work towards the goal of a more peaceful world. That evening he was trying to say something to my wife Inola, and she called me in and we both tried to listen. He mumbled something like, "Damn, Nobody listens to me, and I want to get this off my chest before I no longer am able to find the words. We assured him that we were listening. What we understood was that he was concerned about a group of people somewhere that was working on a plan to make sure that within 1,000 years, mankind will have learned to live together in peace. We had no idea who that group was, but assured him that we would do everything possible to assist towards that goal. Maybe you students are that group. Who knows? Tom died 5 days later, just after the last of his 4 kids had arrived. This said, I will share with you what it felt like growing up Jewish under Nazi rule, being considered surplus human beings, to be eliminated, and how my mother, my brother Fred, and I managed to survive. I will focus on my own experience and that of my oldest brother Tom, who was 8 years older than I, and who had experienced Germany for 13 years before Hitler. My first experience, I usually have these slides that point out to high school kids that this guy didn't bother me as much as the adoring crowds, how easy it was here for him to rope all the young people into his ideology. This was my first day of school in 1934, and you can see a timeline here. This is 1933 to 1945 was in Nazi Germany. And I started school in 1934. And I was enrolled in a regular German public school. There were 52 kids in my class, and I was the only Jewish kid. And it was 1 year after Hitler had come to power, and already the kids, they were not nasty to me. Nobody ever called me dirty Jew or spit in my face or anything of that. They just simply didn't want anything to do with me. And keep in mind that most likely not even half of the parents of these Jews were Nazis. But you didn't want to be considered Jew lover either. So they probably told their kids, leave that Angress kid alone, as they did. And also in the mornings, when we had an assembly around the flagpole, they hoisted first the German flag and then the fascist flag with a swastika in it. And everybody was sitting and standing in attention and doing the Hitler salute and singing the songs. And I, because I was Jewish, had to stand with my hands by my side. And believe me, I didn't want to salute, but I certainly stood out like a sore thumb. My brother, Tom, in the meantime, was already in high school. And his experience, I mean, he was certainly made to feel that he was different. And some of his students fellow students were convinced Nazis, and others tried to protect my brother. My parents went to the school, to the principal, and asked him whether it would be a good idea to transfer my brother to a Jewish school, and the principal said, as long as I'm the principal here, you don't have to worry about it. So my brother stayed in that school till 1936. When he switched to an agricultural school in Germany. It was tough for him, but he stuck it out. Tom, in 1934, joined a Jewish organization called Das Schwarze Fähnlein, loosely translated the Black Pennant. Sort of a Jewish response to the Hitlerjugend. These Jewish kids felt very German, and I want to read to you a short passage from my brother's book. He's writing about his joining the Schwarze Feen line. Of prime importance was the fact that my new friends shared with me the idea that we were first and foremost Germans, whose religious faith happened to be by chance Jewish. As we then saw it, Germany was our fatherland, and it would remain our fatherland. For here not only we were born, but also our parents and their parents and so forth. Naive as we then were, we firmly believed that all we had to do was to prove to the new German government that in all our being, our thinking and our action, we were German and would remain German. In consequence, we would then be accepted into the broad front of German renewal. Well, I never did have positive feelings towards Germany in my youth because I never experienced Germany before Hitler. I was 5 years old when he came to power. In 1936, my brother entered an agricultural training center called Großbresend for Jewish non-Zionist kids because it was deemed correctly that there was no future for Jews in Germany and that with an agricultural training one could find work anywhere on earth. Most of the young people of Großbresend did survive and then ended up all over the world, in the US, Canada, Brazil, Israel, Kenya, South Africa, Australia, and others. They were a tight bunch and stayed in contact with each other to this day for those that are still living. In the meantime, my parents decided that I needed to transfer to a Jewish school, and I transferred to the Joseph Lehmann Schule. And in 1936, there were the Berlin Olympics, and the Jewish schools decided to have their own mini-Olympics. And as you can see, these are the athletes here, and I was too young to participate, and I was selected to carry the name of the school, the placard. Keep this picture in mind, it comes back later on. My brother Fred participated. He medaled in high jump and 100-meter dash. We lived in a busy street in Berlin. Oh, wait a moment. Can we go back one?
Underneath. If you push it underneath. On the bottom. Can you take it back, Craig? Two slides. There you go.
Sorry about that. We lived in a busy street in Berlin, and this was our apartment here. And on Sunday morning, my brother and Fred and I sat on the desk of my father, which was right in front of this window, and watched what was going on in the street down below. And besides the traffic, the brown shirts, the Nazi brown shirts, came marching down the street and sang songs like, "When the Jewish blood squirts off the knife, things go twice as well." And as you can imagine, I didn't particularly care for that ditty, and asked my parents, what's going on here? Why do they want my blood squirting off the knife? And my parents told me, well, don't worry about it, that's their problem, not yours. And unfortunately, it turned out to be my problem. Ultimately, in 1937, my parents decided to leave Germany. My father could not continue with his profession, and it was clear that Jews had no future in Germany. But he decided to take his hard-earned money along, which was against German law. You had to pay a tax, which, when you all added up, amounted to about 75% of your savings. And he had a family of 5 to take care of and start a new business somewhere in the world. So he paid a young lady who had a suitcase with a double bottom to carry the money for him to Holland, and she probably got about 10% for her efforts. We split up. My mother, my brother, and I took the train from Berlin through Holland and ended up in London on the. We took the boat from Holland here to, I think it's Norwich. And my father and my oldest brother were going to go by plane to Amsterdam, and they canceled the flight. In the meantime, the Nazis had been made aware that we were fleeing, and so they started looking for us. But neither my father nor my brother knew about that, but they were still in Germany, and my brother went by train to Amsterdam, and when he came to the border patrol said, Angress, where are your parents? And he said, they're in Berlin. And the officers talked to each other and then said, well, we are looking for a family of 5, and let them go. My father, in the meantime, took the train to Czechoslovakia. There was a train stop at the border. He went out of the train, crossed the border by foot, and ended up safely in Czechoslovakia. And ultimately, we all came together in London. We tried to get to the United States or to South America. We could have gotten to Brazil, but one had to, in those days, convert to Catholicism. They wouldn't allow any Jews. My father absolutely refused. My mother's point of view was 3 drops of water, what do you care? And he paid dearly for that. Also, we had an opportunity to get to Uruguay, and we almost had the visa, and then the consul changed and wanted to be bribed, and my father refused to bribe him. So ultimately, we ended up back in Holland and Amsterdam, where my parents started a new business, and a lingerie store which did very well. A year later, we opened another store in The Hague. And I had 2 wonderful years in Holland, my only normal childhood years, really. This is our class outing in Holland to the Amsterdam Zoo at the 5th grade. This is me with my then girlfriend Hedda. And the fella from Mercy High who put the slide together for me decided to have some fun with it and blow it up. And this is us in 1993 when Inola and I visited Holland. And we are still in touch with each other. Whenever she comes over here, we look her, she visits us up, and whenever we are in Amsterdam, we visit her. My brother Tom, and I hope that's the next slide. Yeah, it's not a very good slide. He managed to get to the United States because he was on an agricultural visa and joined the army, was trained at Camp Ritchie. He was one of the Ritchie boys as an interrogator of prisoners of war. Of course, he knew fluent German. And a few days before D-Day, the 82nd Airborne Division asked for volunteer interrogators. They didn't have enough, and he volunteered. And so his first jump was on D-Day. He never had any practice jumps, and was dropped way behind the lines. Captured by the Nazis, by the German army. Fortunately, they brought him to Cherbourg, and he was liberated a few days later. He later on took part in the Battle of the Bulge and jumped once more in Nijmegen in Holland. And so that's what he was all about. In the meantime, my father, and here's another picture of it. This is Tom again, Fred, me and Fred. Was arrested in 1941 because he took his money along. He got a sentence of 1 year, And as long as he was in prison, he was fine. But when he was done with prisons, he was sent to several concentration camps, ultimately ended up in Auschwitz, where he died 9 days after he arrived. And I keep on finding out more details. The first thing I heard actually was in 1997 through the Red Cross, when I got a date that he died. And he was obviously not herded into the gas chamber as he arrived in Auschwitz, because there are no records of those people. Actually, there was a death certificate from a doctor called Bruno Kitt, who was sentenced and hanged in 1946. He was through the Nuremberg trials. I'm not in favor of the death penalty, but somehow I got some sense of satisfaction out of it. In 1940, the Nazis, in 1941, all Jewish people had to start wearing this gem, which some people tried me to, I should be proud of it. I saw it more as a target and hated it very much. If I want to wear a Star of David around my neck, that should be my choice and not my government's. In 1941, Hitler decided on the final solution. In 1942, as a result of that, there was the infamous conference at the Villa in Wannsee, which is a little suburb of Berlin. There are 15 guys whose job it was. You have to sort of consider these guys as the equivalent of Clark Pest Control. Oh. Only their job was to figure out how to exterminate 11 million Jews. This was what they planned to do. They knew exactly how many Jews there were in what country, including England and Spain and Portugal. And this is what they finally succeeded in accomplishing, 6 million of them. They did their job with typical Prussian efficiency. I went to elementary school in Holland, and the school in Holland is a little bit different than here. The elementary school goes through 6th grade, and after that you have to decide which direction you want to go, and whichever direction you go, you stay with that class all the way through. And it could be as short as 2 years and as long as 7 years. And I had already taken an entrance exams to go to a school that is a 5-year course, mainly with emphasis on math and science. Now, Hedda went to a gymnasium which had nothing to do with gymnastics. It's more classical schooling. And when I had to transfer, when it was forbidden for Jews to go to the regular schools that I already had taken the exam for, I decided I'm going to switch to the gymnasium, hoping that eventually I would end up in Hedda's class again. Well, that was a mistake. I'm much better in math and science. I finally managed to get an F in Greek in 8th grade. But by that time, well, this still is from the last slide. Where's the House of the Wonder? I told you this picture would come back. So I went to, this is an exhibit in the House of the Wonder conference which many German students nowadays visit. And it blew my mind when I visited in 1933 with Inola to find that picture there. And they didn't, the people in that museum didn't know who it was either, and it blew their mind also. Okay, fast forward again to school. So I ended up in the Jewish Lyceum, the Jewish Lycée, where they had different tracks. And I had switched to the gymnasium track, and this was my class, and this was a class that Anne Frank enrolled. So we were schoolmates. We were not classmates, but we were schoolmates. And for about half a year, I cannot really say that I knew the young lady very much. We played volleyball together, and if I remember correctly, she was not the best volleyball player on earth, but then she was a brainiac. Going to school was, here are some slides, there was a book written about our school called Absent. And there are class lists which survived, and here can prove that my class, the first grade in high school and second grade, I'm listed, and she listed in her class in the first grade as Anne Frank. So I can prove that I'm not just blowing hot air. In early 1942, the deportation of the Jewish people in Holland started as a result from the Wannsee Conference, when they actually put the final solution into practice. And so my class of 23 kept on shrinking. And we were 23 students at the end of 1941, and end of 1943, there were 3 of us left. And so you can imagine what it's like when you come to school every morning and look around to see who is there and who is gone. And if somebody is there that after a night that there were raids, razzias as they were called, when they were picked up by the SS to be hauled off to the camps, you could reasonably assume that that person was actually picked up and was gone. If they disappeared when there was nothing going on, then there was a good chance that they had chosen to go into hiding. From my class, actually 12 survived. That's 50%, which is better than the average in Holland, where only 25% survived. From Anne's class, Anne Frank's class, out of 33, 11 survived. So you could say that actually that my class was the luckier one of the two. And not only the students disappeared, but teachers also. My French teacher lasted only for 2 weeks before she was picked up. All those that were picked up, not a single one survived from my class. As I said, in 1942, my brother and 2,000 other Jewish kids in Amsterdam, mostly in the ages of between 18 and 25, got a call to order to report for work for Germany. And Margot Frank, the older sister of Anne, also got that call, as did 2 young ladies who lived with us in Amsterdam. That's when the Frank family went into hiding. My mother managed to land a job for my brother with the Jewish Council, which was an agency that was mandated by the Nazi, and all their edicts were handed down to the Jewish Council and then down to the rest of the Jewish population. And they also performed other services for the Nazis. as a result of becoming part of the Jewish Council, my mother, like I said, managed to get a job land a job for my brother, and that got us this coveted stamp in our ID. And you see that each ID had to have, for a Jewish person, had to have a J, so that it was immediately, that it could immediately be identified. And this stamp tells you that until further notice you are exempt from work in Germany. So we bought ourselves some time. Not only he got the stamp, but my mother and me too. The two young women who lived with us decided, oh, it won't be so bad. They would report as required, as requested. And they packed tennis rackets and sunglasses so that they could have recreational activity after work. My mother just shook her head and basically told them that they were nuts. And but they were not to be deterred. This is where they ended up, in the concentration camp Mauthausen, and where they were made to do heavy work, and when they couldn't do it anymore, fell down, they were put out of their misery with a bullet in their neck. One of the young ladies was already at her age of about 20, a very proficient pianist. She practiced 6 hours a day often, and I get still chills running out my spine when I hear the pieces from Chopin and Beethoven and Liszt that she practiced for hours on end. A few months later, these death notices appeared for every one of the young Jewish people who responded to that call. Not one survived, and that should have been a wake-up call, but few heeded it. And you know, here it says that the person died of a heart attack. The Nazis were very clever, and when I say Germans, I really mean the Nazi Germans. I'm not anti-German, I'm anti-Nazi. So in case of anybody in this group who is German, don't take it personal, please. The job of my brother at the Jewish Council was to go along with the SS at night to round up his fellow Jews. Initially, they brought him to the train on those evenings that they made the raids, and he never knew whether the Nazis could have told him, the SS people, go on the train with him, and that would have been the end of him. But that didn't happen. He always made it home. Later on, it was too cumbersome to run all those trains. They converted a theater in Amsterdam and into a holding facility. They took the seats out and picked up Jewish people during the week, and once a week they shipped them off to the camp. And again, it was the Jewish Council that was running that Jewish theater under the, of course, command of a few SS people. There was a young man by the name of Günther, what's his name? Walter Süßmann. And he decided to try to save as many as he could. Now, the babies that were brought in were kept in a nursery across the street. And so what Walter Süßkind decided he went to mothers who had babies across the street and asked them, are you willing to give up your daughter to some non-Jewish people who will basically safekeep it for you while you go on your trip wherever you're going? And those parents that agreed to that, it were mainly Dutch students that did this kind of work. So they found homes for these kids if the parents agreed. And on the days that they were to be transported, they brought the kids back to their mothers to be put on the train to the camps. And those babies that were not there, they made packages out of it. And it looked like a baby, but it was just a bundle of nothing. And in that way, we don't know exactly how many kids were saved. The assumption that within a year's time, between 600 and 2,000. We don't know exactly. There's no records of that. But at least 600 and probably not more than 2,000. They also try to smuggle adults out occasionally. And then, of course, when they left for the train, they had to count. And again, the kids of the Jewish council did all the counting. And so when they left for the train, and let's say they managed to smuggle 10 people out of the theater, the guy counted 68, 69, 80, 81, 82, and they did that very fast and they were never caught. And one of the reasons why people never get caught is because the Nazis considered the Jews dumb and cowards, and that they wouldn't do anything of the sort. So actually you could get by with a lot of stuff. So in a way, on the one hand, my brother went along to pick up his fellow Jews. On the other hand, I think he helped save a lot of lives. Hopefully that balances out. I leave that up to you guys to judge. I'll share with you now.
Do you need to go back?
Yeah.
How many? Did you go back? 3?
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, okay. I want to show you now a couple of narrow escapes. This is where, can you go back one more? No, okay. Back one more. This is where we left. And one day there was a razzia of the Clio Street. My brother was already working for the Jewish Council, and they sealed off the street. It was in a short street with 2 other streets dead ending on it. So there were 4 entrances to the street. The SS blocked it off, and I saw them come closer and closer. My mother was home, I was home, and a friend of my mother was home. And I was standing behind the curtains here, and then finally the SS man rang the doorbell, and I stood behind the window there. I could see him, he couldn't see me. There were heavier drapes than there are now. And it was like staring death into its face. My mother had told me, and my brother, a long time ago, if the Nazis ever get a hold of you, run. The worst that can happen to you is that they shoot you, and believe me, that is better than what you're going to find at the end of the train ride they want to put you on. And so when that SS man rang the door, well, I remembered those words. And I grabbed my mother, and I didn't know whether she would follow me. But fortunately she did. She left a friend behind because he was heavy set and he wouldn't be able to run. And we went out to the back porch across this, and fortunately we knew the people that lived across. Fortunately their back door was open, and we slipped into that back door, and not 30 seconds later the SS man that had rang the door had gone to our neighbors and entered our apartment through the back door. 30 seconds later, I wouldn't be here. Another narrow escape was my brother was aware that there would be a huge raid one day, and we decided to take shelter in the office that he worked of the Jewish Council. It was actually an apartment, but it was converted into an office. And we thought that the Nazis would leave it alone, but they didn't. They came to the office, and as soon as they came there, it was obvious that I was way too young to work there. But a couple of my brother's buddies took me upstairs into this room up here and put a chair on a table, and there was a trapdoor to the attic. And I pushed the trapdoor open, disappeared in the attic, closed the door, and they took the chair and the table away so that it was not obvious. And so I was up there balancing on the joists and got the scare of my life when the trapdoor opened, but fortunately only another kid came up. In the meantime, I was, of course, sweating it. I knew that the Nazis were down there, that my brother and my mother was out there, and I had no idea what was happening. There was a good chance that they would have hauled everybody away, and I was starting to wonder, what am I going to do? Am I going to try to join them? And I knew if I did that my mother would be furious. And well, I sweated it out up there, and then I had to pee. And I had those beams and the glass and plaster ceiling under me. And I didn't want to lose my life because of a yellow stain in the ceiling down below. And behold, there was an empty wine bottle. It might be still up there, vintage 1943. In the meantime, down below, what the Nazis did is put everybody in the building in one room, a large room, and then they had the list of the people that were working there, and they called the names. Now, my brother managed to slip out of the room, and he had a band identifying him as being of the Jewish Council. He slipped out of the room, and when the name Angress was called, my mother slipped across instead of he. So you had to be fast-witted. Fortunately, nobody said she didn't work here. And that's how we survived that one. Then ultimately, in the fall of 1943, my brother came home one day and said, early in the year, all the Jewish people in Amsterdam had to move into what amounted to a ghetto. The few that were left were all herded together in a small area of the city, rather dilapidated. I urged my mother to go into hiding at that time, and she wasn't quite ready for it, so we did make the move. But 2 months later, the gig was up. My brother came home. Tonight is the last night. Tonight they're going to pick us up, and fortunately my mother had made preparations for that. She ordered a taxi. How she managed to do that is beyond me still, because there were hardly any taxis around. There was no gasoline around. I took off this gem, and we were chauffeured to an address quite near where I used to live, of a German lady who ran a workshop, and she locked us up into a room full of sewing machines, where in daytime people sewed gloves and caps out of fur for the soldiers on the Russian front. It was after hours, so there was nobody there. We were given a potty and a bottle of water, and we were told we had to be absolutely quiet because her boyfriend, who was a Nazi, would come and visit her that night. So yes, I mean, here are three Jewish people in hiding with a German lady who has a Nazi boyfriend. And yes, we were quiet. We heard the guy come and go in the next morning, and after that we left with our meager belongings. I mean, all we could carry along is a change of clothes and a couple of toilet articles. And we are dispersed. I didn't realize that at that time already the Dutch resistance movement had taken charge of us. I ended up for a couple of weeks with another friend of my, not a friend, but acquaintance, business acquaintance of my father, a German non-Jewish lady who lived in a boarding house which was run by two very religious Christian ladies, and I felt quite safe there. But I had, it was a studio apartment, and by that time I was 15 years old, so it was not a situation that I could stay any length of time. But they told me they were looking for a permanent address for me. I did not see my brother and my mother again until after the war had ended. After 2 weeks, they told me they had found a home for me, and that's when Mr. Kui came, and well, here is a slide where I spent my time in hiding. This was the apartment, and this is the entrance, where I spent a year and a half. And as you can see, there are 8 families living here. They were told that I was an orphan from Rotterdam, and I doubt whether any of them believed that. Of course, my ID actually did show that. Ali and Tom, this is Tom Kui at the time. He was a member of the several Dutch resistance groups. And this is the 2 of them later on in Danville. After the war, I helped them get to the United States, where they did very well. So in the meantime, I spent most of my time at home. I got a false ID. They were really artists. They removed the J out of my ID. They changed my birthplace from Berlin to Rotterdam. My name became Andreas. I only had to change 2 letters. And because it was, they also managed to get me a master coupon because you needed coupons to buy all your food. Everything was rationed, and if you had to buy it on the black market, it cost you 10 times as much as with coupons. For instance, a pound of butter cost about $60 at the time, just to give you an idea. So in order to go into hiding, I mean, there are 5 things that were necessary to go into hiding. A, you had to know what's going on. B, you had to be willing, especially since the Jewish council people told you you are much better off if you do what you are told, because otherwise if they catch you, you are going to be punished. Well, you were going to end up either way. Of course, the Nazis didn't advertise that. But after the first bunch, every single one was killed. It was obvious what was going to happen. And then you had to have the means. And you had to have people who were willing to risk their life to save yours. And finally, you had to have some luck. I mean, the big difference between Anne Frank and myself is that her luck ran out and mine held. About the Dutch population, it is my guess that about 5% of the Dutch population became Nazis or collaborated with them. 5% probably were resisting them in many different ways, and 90% were the so-called bystanders. The Coy family was a blue-collar worker family. They had a small apartment, 2 bedrooms, and the bedroom of the sons, Peter and Walter, could only accommodate 2 beds. It was about 8 by 16 feet, so it was very narrow. So those 2 boys had to sleep in one bed, toe to toe, for a year and a half. I mean, not only did the parents risk their life to save mine, but it was a real inconvenience for the kids. And these kids were told exactly what was going on. And they were 5 and 7 years old at the time. They were told that I was Jewish, that I was hiding there, that they couldn't share that with their friends, that they couldn't visit with their friends after school, and that none of their friends could come to visit them. So it was a real hardship on those kids too. The time in hiding for me was actually a high, because the Cui family was, especially Ton Cui, was heavily involved in resistance activity, and the resistance had many different ways of doing it. They helped people in hiding, and remember, when not only the Jews went into hiding, but many Dutch young people also, because if you were out of work in Holland and you were young and healthy, they shipped you off to Germany as forced labor. All the German men were soldiers, and they needed workers. So there were probably over 100,000 young Dutch non-Jews in hiding, and 28,000 Jews went into hiding, of which 16,000 survived. Of course, that was a much better percentage than of the 100,000 that went to the camps, out of which only 5,000 survived. So obviously, going into hiding was by far the better choice. One of the things that the Ton Cui did is they had to provide coupons, food coupons, for people in hiding in order to make it halfway, be able to pay for food for these people, because what you could get on your coupons was barely enough to keep one person alive. You couldn't, there was not really enough to share. So in order to get those coupons, they had to raid a distribution center somewhere in Holland once a month. And, you know, they had to try to get a hold of 100,000 sheets of coupons. And they needed weapons to do that. And they could not raid the same place over and over. So they had to raid a center in one city 1 year, and another city another year, 1 month, and another city another month, distribution centers, and hold them by train. And one day he was on the train, and they came to check everybody's luggage. They weren't really expecting any weapons and ammunition. What they expected was butter and eggs and stuff that people illegally had gone to buy from farmers, which was not allowed. So they opened and confiscated what they could. And they came to Grandpa Larot, and he was a short guy with a very sweet face, and he was a merchant marine in his earlier life. And I said, well, Grandpa, what have you got in your suitcase, in your satchel there? And he looks up at them and says, guns and ammunition. And they laughed. Oh, Grandpa. They never opened it. Again, they did not, they knew that all the people in the train really hated them, and they didn't want to look foolish. And they expected if they opened their satchel and out comes this long johns and toothbrush, and that they would look foolish. And of course, he was trained to do that. They knew that that could happen. The Cuis provided a hiding place for me. They cut a piece of, between two joists, they made a little trapdoor and put a smooth board underneath there because it was directly on the ceiling down below, on the Plaza Master. And one day they wanted to see how long I could last in there. And so, and how fast I could get in there. So we made a trial run. Somebody rang the bell, and I went down in there. And so I was down there 10, 15, 20 minutes, and didn't have any trouble, really. I had plenty of air. But I found a bolt that I could twist, and I didn't know what it was. And the next morning, the lady from downstairs came up and said, "Guess what, Mrs. Cooey, last night I was sitting in my living room, and here was that hanging plant, and all of a sudden it started twirling." And the message was basically, better be careful with what you're doing. Towards the end, I was allowed to help with the distribution of food coupons. I mean, the Cooey family was one of the central places where the big stacks came, and then they had to be distributed to other organizations. When you talk about the Dutch resistance movement, it was not one homogeneous group. There were the Catholics, and there were the Protestants, and there were the Socialists, and there were the Communists, and who knows how many groups. But they did work together until about 2-3 months before the war was ended, when it was obvious that the Nazis had lost the war, and then everybody started jockeying for position for after the war, when the Dutch would regain their power over their country. And that's when the cooperation started to fall apart. And one day I was to deliver a wheel of cheese. Of course, that was worth gold. Again, to be distributed to people in hiding. And I had it in my bag and delivered the wheel to where I was supposed to deliver it. And it was also interesting. I was never to know the street or the number. I was not to look, because the Nazis, if they catch you, would use torture. We knew that. So I was told, you go, so many streets there, and then the third entrance, go up, and was instructed, don't look at the street name, don't look at any names. And all the people that came through our house all had aliases. None used their own name. And there were plenty of them. There was lots of activity. So I had delivered the cheese and was on my way home, and I ran into the Cub Scout leader that I knew had turned Nazi. Both, I mean, when I was in the Cub Scouts, we had two leaders. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Jungle Book, but the Aquila was the wolf, mother wolf, Bagheera was the Black Panther, and Baloo was the bear. And so the Cub Scouts used for their leaders, Aquila, Bagheera, and Baloo. And Aquila and Bagheera both had turned Nazi. And so all of a sudden we stood face to face. And I hesitated for a minute, and I thought, I might as well take the bull by the horn. And so I went up to her, I said, "Hey, Bagheera, I guess you realize that I'm in hiding, and I would appreciate if you don't denounce me." And she said, "Of course not." And she went one way, and I went the other way, and I didn't go straight home. I made sure that I wasn't being followed. But that was a scary moment. One of my jobs was to listen to the British broadcast, which was strictly forbidden. You were only allowed to, you were not even allowed to have a radio that could receive radio waves. Only radios you were allowed were the radios that were cabled into your house. And of course we had a radio, and I had the time, so I listened to the Dutch broadcast of the British BBC, which was called Radio Oranje, and I still can hear it. Dit is Radio Oranje, de stem van Vrij Nederland. It was music to my ears. And of course, on D-Day, I was on that radio the entire day and just hoped and prayed that they would succeed. It was one of the most exciting days of my hiding period. These are the coupons again. This is a master. This is a master coupon, and these are the coupons that you got every month, and that was for bread and cheese and eggs and bread and clothing, and you needed so many coupons for different things. And this is a MasterCard, and every time you pick one of these up, it crosses out of there. So when I first got my false ID, they also gave me a MasterCard, and the first time I wanted to pick up my card myself once I had all those papers, that if anything was wrong, that I would be picked up and not Ali Dakui. Fortunately, all the stamps was in the right place, and I deliberately went to a guy who wore the little Nazi pin, a triangle, half red, half black, and gave him my card, this one, and he handed me that one, and that was the end of it. Amsterdam was on the flight path from England to Berlin, and often in daytime 1,000 American planes going overhead. They usually came in about waves of 100, and then there was a period of quiet, and then there came another 100, and it was a sight to behold. And Anne Frank, in her book, wrote that she was scared of them. For me, it was music to my ears. And one day, one plane was shot down, and the engine had stopped, and the crew was bailing out. They came floating down, and I watched them come down. And the Nazis were shooting at their parachutes. Later on, I heard that all of them made it down safely. Half of them, the Nazis caught and made them prisoner of war, and the other half, the Dutch resistance got a hold of, and they had ways to get them back to England, by way of Portugal, actually. Another day, I was home alone, and there was again a plane that was disabled, and I was standing in front of the window, and it looked like it was coming straight at me. And I was thinking for a minute, and what shall I do now? And I said, you know, whether I stay here or whether I move doesn't really make much difference. If I move, it might end up there. I might as well stay and watch it. And then it reared off and crashed in the street, and fortunately it only killed one street vendor. My mother, in the meantime, I only found that out later, she was hiding in, this was a boarding house where we first stayed when we came to Holland. And it was taken over by the German military. They had officers in there. And she was living in one of these two rooms, I don't know which one, in the attic. And she became Mrs. Kiefer, her maiden name, and she was a maid. And she made their beds and cleaned their rooms and probably flirted with them and had her fingernails done once a week and her hair coiffed. My mother had her priorities. And that's how, again, the Nazis never expected a Jew to have this kind of guts. And I must say, you know, my mother was not a warm, fuzzy mother, but she sure as heck came through when it counted. In Amsterdam, the war suddenly ended. We never got liberated. the Allied didn't make it over the, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the bridge too far at Arnhem. When the 101st Airborne Division jumped on top of two German Panzer tank divisions, and well, that didn't end up so well. And then the Allied decided to forget about the northern part of Holland and went for Berlin instead. So for me, the end of the war, it just petered out. And a couple of days after the war had stopped, the Germans were still there, the Nazis were still there, but they didn't do anything. And I was told that the Canadians would arrive, and they would take over temporarily until the Dutch could get their act together and to rule their country again. And I wanted to see those guys come in, to have some kind of closure. And I was told where they were going to end up, where they were going to come. And there were thousands of people there. And finally I saw something coming down the road. And the first thing that I saw was a black dude on a Harley Davidson with the biggest smile on his face that you can imagine. And to this day, my symbol of freedom is this grin on this black dude's face. A few days later, my brother arrived. His commanding general, Slim Jim as he was called, James Gavin, had given him permission to look for his family. He and another guy who also had family in Holland gave him a jeep and gave him unlimited furlough. So he showed up on Mother's Day, and that reunited the four of us. The next two slides you are familiar with. Well, since...
They bear repeating.
Pardon?
They bear repeating.
Yeah, the lessons learned, for me at least, and I think for a lot of people, is that the inhumanity from men to men or people to people continues. And I came to the conclusion that evil people in power can make perfectly decent people commit horrendous acts. Because not all the people that carried out, I mean, many of them just figured they were doing their duty. And the next thing is really, that intelligent evil people are far more dangerous than dumb evil people. Dumb people are merely obnoxious. Intelligent, the evil people are deadly. And when targeted for persecution, be realistic and protect yourself, which way too few people did. I don't know that not all Jewish people could have gone into hiding, but a lot of more could have. And few people are heroes risking their lives to save others. And ask yourself, what would you have done? If I would have approached you, one did not know what exactly the Nazis were going to do with you when they tripped you off. But what one did know is that if they catch you, in Holland, they probably would put the father into jail. In Poland, he would have shot the whole family. Everybody there would have been shot on sight. The Nazis behaved quite different in Western Europe than in Eastern Europe. And now that the war was over, I found myself on my own at age 17. My mother was in no position to support me, and my father did not return. I did not see much of a future for me in Holland. When my oldest brother Tom offered to help my brother Fred and me to get to the United States, we jumped at the opportunity. When I got to the US with $25 in my pocket, I first finished high school in Lenox, Massachusetts. I then took a job on a dairy farm in Connecticut. When I got an offer for a position on a dairy in Marin County, I decided to go west. I became a partner in a dairy operation on Tomales Bay, which is now known as the Strauss Family Farm, and the partnership lasted for 20 years. After we split up for personal reasons, I became a real estate broker, first doing sales and later mainly property management. I've been married twice. I have 6 children from my first marriage, 12 grandkids and 5 great-grandkids as of last month. My second wife, Enola, and I have been married for over 30 years. She helped me raise my 2 youngest. I am often asked why I do not seem angry. The answer is that I was angry at first about what happened to me growing up, but I also was numb. Caring mainly for cows for 20 years allowed me not to have to deal with my anger. Ultimately, with parting from Enola, I got counseling and realized that anger is a waste of energy and to instead channel my efforts into matters that are productive. Speaking to students like you also has helped me get rid of anger because I hope that by sharing my story, I can urge young people to choose a positive path in life, not a destructive one. Please don't take democracy for granted. It is fragile. Remember, Hitler was elected. Shortly after that, he declared a state of emergency that was never lifted, which gave him unlimited dictatorial power. Stay politically informed and involved and exercise your rights to vote. I'm hopeful for the future, but there's work to be done, and I'm afraid that much of it is up to you because our generation has failed to adequately deal with the many long-range problems we face. I wish you guys strength, good luck, and a better world. And I took advantage of this. These are tiles that I bought for my parents and for the Kuis, and I'm getting another one for my brother. So I'm grateful to Sonoma State for giving me the opportunity to have somewhere a place to remember these good people.
Questions? Yes, Cynthia.
When did you find out about your father? How old were you when you found out about your father?
How old I was when he was taken away?
When you found out.
When did you find out that he had passed or that he had been complicated?
Well, that was in 1997. I was in my 70s by that time. So for over 60 years, I had no idea what. I mean, I thought that he went to Auschwitz, but I got so many different stories that I really didn't know. And I now have, my brother managed to get a hold of the entire trial of this Dr. Bruno kid, which is fascinating. Also, all the defense that he brought up was unbelievable. It's a whole document.
It has only been recently that many documents have been available to people. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the staff there, has been insistent on making the International Red Cross give up some of those records, and because of that, many people are now able to track down what happened to their families. Yes?
Yeah.
You said you found a death certificate that was issued for your dad in Auschwitz to the Red Cross. Did they issue death certificates for everybody who died there?
Yes. I mean, the ones that they herded into the gas chamber didn't get their certificates. But those that they selected to work that were of some use to them and that they got the tattoo, there they kept meticulous records of. And there are tons more. There's a place called Bad Arolsen that seems to have millions of documents that really haven't been looked at yet. Yeah.
Yes, Hans, since this was many, many, many years before Facebook and Twitter and things like that, I was curious when you were in hiding in Denmark, Holland, excuse me, did you, how much information did you have about what was happening to Jews throughout Europe and other places?
Well, the Dutch had an enormous amount of underground newspapers. There were 4 or 5 major ones. Some of them still exist that were started then. And again, the Dutch resistance movement, I mean, I could talk hours just on that, but they kept on publishing newspapers, and we got regular, at least 2 or 3 different ones, and so we knew what was going on, and also the news, the listening to the radio kept us informed. And of course, when you read the Nazi newspapers, when they withdrew somewhere, it does not show. It just showed that they went from here to there, but they didn't say whether in what direction. Yeah, either one.
Carol?
Yeah.
How did you occupy your time while you were in hiding for a year and a half?
How did you occupy your time while you were in hiding?
Many different ways. I was fortunate that they had a good library, so I did a lot of reading. And then we had a map on the wall, and I made little flags for each division: American, English, Russian, the Jewish brigade, the Brazilian brigade, and the American. I mean, they were on pins. They were about ½ an inch by an inch, and the American flags had 13 stripes and 48 dots on a blue field, and on both sides. So it kept me busy for many years. And for a while, they also had a tutor for me. But that became expensive, and yeah.
You mentioned your brother wrote a book. Is it possible to get the title of the book?
It's not. It is in the process of being translated into English. It's in German. It's called Immer etwas abseits, always a little bit off center.
Which brother wrote the book?
Tom. Yeah, my other brother also wrote his memoirs. They are not published, but surviving in the survived in the lion's den, because he actually operated out of the SS office. Yeah.
Are you guys able to communicate to be able to get back together?
While we were in hiding,
Yes.
we didn't. It was way too dangerous.
Did you want to know how they found each other?
Yes, and I found each other.
Oh, we agreed that when the war ended, would go to the last known address that I showed. And these people were very accommodating, and that's where my brother from the 82nd also went to. I mean, we said, this is the only spot, so that's where we found each other. And there were people who know the Dutch resistance movement knew where each one of us was, but they did not want to risk. So many people got caught carrying letters from one to the other, and it was that's how many people lost their lives through sheer stupidity.
So when you came to the United States, you were 17. You said you finished high school. Did you
found out what marshmallows were. No, I knew very rudimentary English. I had English classes once a week since I was 6 years old. So I could manage somewhat. Of course, I faked it a little bit. In Holland, since you stay with your same class all the way through, I had German, French, Dutch, English, Greek and Latin, and biology and algebra and geometry and all these things for 2 years in high school, but I didn't tell them that I only had it once a week. And I took 5 classes, English 2, English 4, civics, American history, biology, and one other. And I managed to get B's and C's. The biggest challenge was really algebra with a dictionary under your arm. I mean, I didn't know what a square root was. But it was challenging, but it was such a relief to be in a totally different atmosphere. And yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No.
2 questions. My one question is, who did you live with when you were 17? You arrived from Europe. Who picked you up at the boat or whatever? And who did you live with until you got on your own?
Well,
that was one question.
okay, my brother picked me up, and the person that led Großbresen, the agricultural school that he went to, had a brother who had a private school in Lenox, Massachusetts, right next to Tanglewood. And my brother arranged for me to stay there for 4 months to get my high school diploma. And after that, I took a job. And the guy was courageous to turn me loose on 40 cows. They survived it. And then I was asked to bring a 2x4. I had no idea that was a piece of wood. Yeah.
And my other question was, like, until, like you said that, for many years you kind of coped and then you got counseling like way later. How do you cope emotionally? Were you the kind of person that talked to other people about what happened to you, or did you just kind of try to blank it out?
No, I pretty much blanked it out. I just wanted to get on with life. I was glad that I survived. And then I started I was married and I wanted 2 kids, my wife wanted 12, so we ended up with 6. And, farm life, people probably don't realize how it totally embraces you. I mean, it are not the cows that is the big challenge. Big challenge is to keep the whole enterprise going, to keep the fences fixed, to keep the roof from leaking, to upgrade your electricity. I mean, I learned an awful lot. It was the best school I ever could attend. For me to grow up on the farm, and my kids tell me that the best thing I ever did for them to raise them on the farm.
You talked about leaving for the United States when you're 17. At what point were you able to connect back with your mother? Did she ever come to the States?
No, my mother decided she did not want to be a burden on her kids. So she married a gentleman from London, and we visited her and she visited us. It was a marriage of convenience, but it worked reasonably well. And so she had and toward the end of her life, she had a stroke, and we had to come over to the United States. She actually passed away in Petaluma at the age of 92.
I would like to point something out. Hans showed us a picture of the memorial grove. For those of you who have never been there, it's at the lakes. I invite you to go see it. It's really quite wonderful. But one of the very exciting things is, I hope it's not too much longer, we were awarded a tree, a sapling from the Anne Frank tree in Amsterdam. And one of the factors, although not the only one, that was responsible for us getting that award was the fact that we could say someone was in the same school at the same time with Anne Frank. And the committee was very impressed with the symbolism of all of that, of being able to bring the tree over to us.
Okay, so I know that, you came here and you were with the cows and that really helped you, find peace and stuff like that. But, was there never a possibility of you living back in Germany again? I understand what you're saying about,
Well,
I understand what you're saying about, your Nazi Germans are the ones that, you dislike, which is obvious, and it's not
So-
Germans, but
So what you're asking is, did he ever consider living in Germany again?
yeah, no, that's interesting you ask. No, for me it was impossible. But my oldest brother, who had a career in this country as a history professor, first teaching in Berkeley and later on at Stony Brook, Long Island, after he retired, he decided to go back to Germany. And one of the reasons where I think he did, that he wanted to experience the Germany that was denied him in his childhood. And he did much good work in Germany. I mean, he did a lot of speaking, and the Germans, here was this American soldier that was part of liberation of a concentration camp. And I think, I will let you know when this book finally comes out in English. He had an interesting life. And also, he was a very human person. For instance, he was taken prisoner when he jumped on D-Day. And he never let on. I mean, if they would have found out that he was a German Jew, they would have shot him immediately. He didn't. And the army, his captors, treated him decently. And then later on, when the roles were reversed, his buddies tried to convince him to let his former captors know that he basically managed to deceive them. And he said, no, they treated me decently and I'm going to treat them decently. So that's what the kind of person he is, or was. For him, it was almost logical to go back. For me, I haven't had any positive experiences in Germany. And the first time Inola and I went back, we went into a apartment store, and it was very busy, and all of a sudden I was surrounded by all this German speaking. And during the war, hearing German meant danger, and I just freaked out, and I told Inola I had to get out of here. And last summer, when my brother was failing, we actually had planned a visit to a family reunion in Berlin. He didn't want to travel anymore, and that's when his health ultimately failed. But again, I visited last summer Berlin twice, and now I'm done with Germany. There are other countries that I rather visit. And that doesn't mean, the other day I went to an art show in Petaluma, and a man came up to me, he was a German, and basically apologized to me for what his countrymen did. I mean, in a way, I feel sorry for the young German people who will have to live with the guilt of their grandparents. I'd rather be a child of a victim than a child of a perpetrator.
Please join me in thanking Hans.